For 18 years, Chairman Kang Jin-woo had mistaken presence for loyalty and silence for consent. He had taken a life, a whole and complex human life, and reduced it to a function, an exquisitely performed, utterly reliable function. It was his single greatest failure of management, and he had not even logged it as a risk. Now, that function had ceased. The system it ran was not breaking, it was simply gone. The consequence was not chaos, it was silence. A profound and meticulously engineered silence that was, he would soon learn, far worse than chaos. The call came from Tokyo, from a man whose respect he had spent 2 decades earning. Mr. Tanaka did not waste words. 7 words, Kong, the old man said, his voice raspy with a pity that felt like a razor. She was the only one who still looked at you without a calculator. And with that, the chase began. The chase to understand what one sees when they are not calculating. By the way, wherever in the world you're watching from right now, let me know in the comments. I love seeing how far these stories reach. Okay, where were we? The grand ballroom of the Yongdo National Museum was a testament to his control. 200 of the city's most influential figures moved through a space transformed by light and money into a living sculpture of power. The air, cooled to a precise 21 degrees Celsius, smelled of white lilies and ambition. Each place setting, each crystal glass, each curated piece of conversation was an extension of Chairman Kang's will. He stood on a low dais, a man of 56 who looked a decade younger, dressed in a charcoal suit so perfectly tailored it seemed less like clothing and more like a second, more formidable skin. His posture was stillness itself, a quiet anchor in the swirling room. He was performing. He was performing the part of Chairman Kang, the benevolent titan, the city's benefactor, and the performance was flawless. From his vantage point, he could see the entire ecosystem he had built. The mayor, laughing a little too loudly at a joke told by one of Kang's construction foremen. The chief of police, his gaze sweeping the room with a proprietary air that Kang himself had paid for. Bankers, developers, media owners, all circulating, all connected by invisible threads of obligation and opportunity that led, ultimately, back to him. What is seen is managed, he thought, the old family aphorism rising in his mind. It was the principle upon which he had built his entire world. Everything here was seen, everything was managed. And yet, a profound disquiet settled over him. It was a familiar feeling these last few hours, a low-frequency hum of wrongness beneath the polished surface of the evening. He scanned the perimeter of the room, a habit born of a lifetime of vigilance. He was not looking for a threat. He was looking for a specific absence. He was looking for Park Min-hee. For 18 years, at every event like this, she had been a fixed point. A quiet, unobtrusive presence, usually near an exit, her attention not on the spectacle, but on its mechanics. She would stand with a stillness that mirrored his own, her gaze catching the one waiter whose jacket was improperly buttoned, the subtle shift in humidity that might affect the flowers, the first sign of fatigue in an elderly guest. She did not manage people. She attended to the texture of the reality they inhabited. Her absence tonight felt less like a missing person and more like a flaw in the physics of the room. He had told himself it was irritation. When his driver had arrived that morning, the car was merely clean, not immaculate. The daily briefing on his desk was a printout from his corporate office, not the hand-collated summary of news, market sentiment, and personal correspondence he was used to. Small things, trivial things. He had assumed she was ill. He had felt a flash of annoyance at the inconvenience, at the disruption to his perfectly calibrated routine. He had not felt concern. The emotion was so foreign in relation to her, he would not have recognized it. Concern was for assets at risk, for variables in a negotiation. Min-hee was a constant. Director Choi materialized at his elbow, a ghost in a tuxedo. Choi was Kang's formal second-in-command, a man whose ambition was as sharp and cold as the crease in his trousers. Chairman, the Minister of Culture is deeply impressed. He said you have single-handedly redefined corporate philanthropy in this city. Kang gave a slight nod, his eyes still sweeping the crowd. Did you hear from Min-hee? Is her fever any better? He kept his tone casual, a question about a subordinate's minor ailment. Choi's expression was one of perfect, practiced empathy. I'm afraid not, Chairman. Her phone goes straight to the message bank. I sent one of the household staff to her apartment to check on her, but there was no answer. I'm sure it's just a bad flu. We can manage. We can manage, Kang repeated, the words tasting like ash. Of course they could manage. Management was what they did. But the disquiet was deepening, coalescing into something colder. He looked at Choi, truly looked at him, and saw the smooth, reflective surface of a professional. He saw a calculator. He scanned the room again, at the mayor, the bankers, the artists, and saw a sea of calculators, all tallying their own private sums. Tanaka's words echoed in his mind. She was the only one who still looked at you without a calculator. He had dismissed it as the sentimentality of an old man. Now he was not so sure. The gala proceeded. Speeches were made. A check for $10 million was presented to the museum's director, the flashbulbs popping in a blinding, sterile wave. Kang smiled. He shook hands. He performed. But his mind was elsewhere. It was in the silence of his penthouse that morning, a silence that had felt different. It was in the stack of unread newspapers on his kitchen counter, a small monument to a broken ritual. He had always believed that his power came from his ability to command, to direct, to manage everything and everyone he could see. Now, for the first time, he was beginning to suspect that the real power, the true center of his world, resided in something he had never bothered to look at all. The gala ended. The applause was loud and sustained, but the only thing Kang could hear was the unnerving hum of a single, silent, missing piece. He needed to go home. He needed to see the empty room for himself. The elevator ride to the penthouse was a silent 50-second ascent through the heart of the building he owned. The doors opened, not into a foyer, but directly into the vast, open space of his apartment. The city of Yangdo sprawled below, a glittering carpet of light, but the view brought him no comfort tonight. The air inside was still and cold, the same 21 degrees as the ballroom, but here it felt different. It felt sterile, dead. The lilies had been arranged by a service. The lighting was on an automated timer. The whole place felt like a showroom, a high-end hotel suite, waiting for a guest who would never feel at home. He walked past the cavernous living area, his leather-soled shoes making no sound on the dark wood floors. He bypassed his own master suite, a space as impersonal as a monk's cell, albeit a very wealthy monk. He walked down the quiet, white corridor to the rooms that had been designated for Park Min-hee 18 years ago. Her wing. He had always thought of it that way, a clinical architectural term, a wing of the property, not a home. The door was slightly ajar. He pushed it open. The first thing he noticed was the smell, or rather, the lack of it. Min-hee's rooms had always had a faint, clean scent of green tea and old paper. Now, there was nothing. Only the same faint chemical odor of the cleaning products the household staff used everywhere else. The space was not merely empty, it had been scrubbed of personality, neutralized. He stepped inside. Her bedroom was to the left. The bed, a simple wooden frame he distantly recalled her choosing years ago, was made with military precision. The white duvet was pulled taut, the pillows perfectly fluffed and dented in the center, a gesture of order that was almost violent in its exactitude. Nothing lay on the nightstand except a small white envelope. The built-in closets stood open. They were completely empty. Hangers, dozens of them, hung in a neat, silent row. Her desk, which had always been a controlled clutter of books, notebooks, and pens, was bare. The surface of the dark wood reflected the cool, recessed lighting from the ceiling. It looked like it had been polished. He walked into the adjoining room, her study. The bookshelves that lined one wall, which had been crammed with a chaotic mix of modern fiction, classical philosophy, poetry, and dense histories of art and urban planning, were now vacant. Not a single book remained. Dust motes danced in the air where they had once rested. He ran a hand along a shelf. It was clean. Too clean. This was not a hasty departure. This was a systematic erasure. He returned to the bedroom and picked up the envelope from the nightstand. His name, Chairman Pang, was written on the front in her familiar, precise script. It was not his handwriting, but it was just as controlled. Inside, there was no letter, no explanation, no farewell. There was only a single sheet of high-quality bond paper, folded once. He opened it. It was a list. Household accounts, passwords, garden and landscaping service, Jang, contact number and schedule attached, aquarium maintenance, aquatic life solutions, bi-monthly, second Tuesdays, next visit is the 14th, annual property tax installment, due by the 30th, funds are in the secondary Drexel account, grandmother's memorial, chrysanthemums ordered from Yi Flora. Delivery on the 22nd. The list continued for another 10 items, a complete and total transfer of the invisible labor that made his life function. It was a resignation letter, written in the language of logistics. It was the most brutally efficient and impersonal document he had ever read. At the very bottom, separated from the list by a wide margin, was a single, handwritten sentence. I have my own $5 now. He read the sentence 3 times. $5. The words meant nothing to him. It was a code he could not decipher, a reference to a world he did not share. It felt nonsensical, almost childish. Was this a joke? A final, petty insult? He felt a surge of the familiar irritation, hot and sharp. The sheer inconvenience of it all, the disrespect. He would have to instruct Choi to hire a new household manager, an agency. It would be a nuisance, a series of interviews, a disruption. He was thinking in terms of replacement, of plugging a hole in the system. He looked around the empty, sterile room again. The open, vacant closets, the bare shelves, the smell of nothing. And the cold understanding finally began to dawn, pushing past his anger. This was not an inconvenience. This was not a resignation. This was a verdict. She had not just left. She had vanished. And she had taken 18 years of her life with her, leaving behind only the clean, empty space where it had been. The silence in the penthouse was no longer just an absence of sound. It was the sound of a judgment being rendered. And the $5, he suspected with a growing dread, was not the point. It was the proof. Proof of a transaction he had been a part of but had never witnessed. The cascade began the next morning at 8:05 a.m. Kang was sitting at his vast obsidian desk, the city spread out below him like a circuit board, when his private line rang. It was Lee Byung-ho, head of the Yeongdo Port Authority, a man whose loyalty was a cornerstone of Kang's shipping interests. Jinwoo, Lee began, his voice strained, dispensing with the usual honorifics. We have a problem. The union is calling a snap strike, effective immediately. They're citing unsafe working conditions on Pier 4. Kang was unmoved. This was his world. Problems were the raw material of his power. They do this every 2 years, Byung-ho. It's posturing. Offer them a 3% bonus. Remind them who paved the road to the new union hall. There was a pause. I did. I offered 5%. They laughed. Their representative, a new young fellow, said their position was non-negotiable. He said the trust was broken. He used that exact phrase, Jinwoo. The trust is broken. Kang felt the first flicker of genuine alarm. The unions were blunt instruments, but they were predictable. They dealt in money and power, not abstract concepts like trust. What is the specific complaint on Pier 4? That's the thing, Lee said, his voice dropping. There isn't one. Not a real one. The safety reports for the last 6 months have been perfect, immaculate. Your girl, Min-hee, she always came down herself, walked the pier with the foreman. The men trusted her. She'd listened to their wives about school districts, about sick parents. She arranged for that scholarship fund for the dock workers' kids. That wasn't your money, was it? It was from one of your foundations. Kang said nothing. The foundations. He had considered them a public relations expense, a tax write-off. He signed the checks. He attended the galas. He had never once considered how they actually functioned, who they touched. Min-hee had managed them. That was her function. She hasn't been answering her phone, Lee finished, his voice heavy with unspoken accusation. The men are saying, if she's gone, the deal is gone. They don't trust us, Jinwoo. They trusted her. The line went dead. Kang stared at the phone. For the first time, he connected the two events, Min-hee's departure and a disruption in his business. He had compartmentalized her, placed her in the household category. He had failed to see that the household she managed was not just his penthouse. It was the entire invisible architecture of goodwill and faith that held his empire together. At 9:30 a.m., the call came from the mayor's office. Not from the mayor, but from his chief of staff, a woman known for her brutal efficiency. Chairman Kang, we are indefinitely postponing the zoning vote for the waterfront development project. This was a blow. The waterfront project was his flagship, a multi-billion-dollar legacy project. On what grounds? Kang demanded, his voice dangerously quiet. Public sentiment, the woman replied coolly. A consortium of neighborhood associations has filed a joint injunction. They claim the environmental impact studies were falsified and that the project disregards the needs of the local community. That's absurd, Kang snapped. My team spent a year in community outreach. Did they? The chief of staff asked, a rhetorical chill in her voice. The consortium is being advised by a Miss An from the Blue Heron Foundation. She says the only person from your organization who ever truly communicated with them was a Miss Park Min-hee. She says Miss Park was personally guaranteeing a new public library and a daycare center, funded by a grant from the foundation. A grant which, it seems, was never formally filed with your corporate office. Without her, they have no confidence in your promises. The mayor cannot afford to be seen as siding with you against his own constituents. You understand. The call ended. He understood. He understood that the community outreach he had paid for was a series of sterile presentations in community halls. The real outreach, the work that built consensus and belief, had been done by Min-hee, operating in a world of quiet conversations, cups of tea, and promises she intended to keep. He had seen the expense reports for the foundations. He had not seen the value they created, not the real value. The final blow came just before noon. The call from Mr. Tanaka in Tokyo, the one that broke through the last of his defenses. Tanaka was not just a partner. He was a figure of immense moral authority in the Asian business world, the chairman of a century-old keiretsu. His trust was worth more than any bank loan. "Kang-san," Tanaka began, his voice gravelly, "I am pulling our capital commitment from the semiconductor venture." The air left Kang's lungs. This was not a project. This was the future of his entire enterprise. "Tanaka-san, may I ask why? The projections are solid. The technology is sound." "The technology is sound," Tanaka agreed. "The projections are sound, but my confidence is not. For 10 years, I have based my partnership with you on a single, private metric. Every 6 months, your assistant, Miss Park, has sent me a report. It is not a financial report. It is a cultural one. She details the morale of your junior staff. She writes about the families of your executives. She tells me about the old woman who sells flowers outside your headquarters and how your company ensures she has a safe place to work in the winter. She showed me the heart of your organization." Kang was speechless. He had never known. This was a back channel, a stream of data he had never requested, never conceived of. "This morning," Tanaka continued, "I received a final email from her. It contained only a photograph of a single blooming orchid on her desk and a message. The orchid has been moved to a new window. I can no longer guarantee the quality of the light. I do not invest in companies that lose the person who tends the orchids, Kang-san. That is the person who is actually paying attention." Then came the 7 words that shattered him. 7 words, Kang. She was the only one who still looked at you without a calculator. When the line disconnected, Kang did not move. He sat at his desk, the master of a silent, empty penthouse, the chairman of a hollowed-out empire. The strike at the port, the stalled development, the withdrawn capital, they were not separate crises. They were a unified, cascading collapse. He had spent his life managing what he could see, what he could count: the stock price, the square footage, the number of men under his command. And all the while, the real value, the binding agent of trust that held it all together, was flowing through channels he had never bothered to map, tended by a woman he had never bothered to see. He had not lost an assistant. He had lost his foundation. The sun was low in the sky, casting long, mournful shadows across the polished floors, when Kang finally rose from his desk. The day had been a blur of cancellations and deferrals, a slow, orderly dismantling of the world he had built. Each call had been a fresh amputation. He no longer felt anger or irritation. He felt a profound, chilling emptiness, a void where his certainty used to be. He walked back to Minhee's wing, drawn by a need to understand the geography of his failure. The evening light, soft and gray, filled the empty rooms. It was a different light from the harsh, electric glare of the previous night. It was a light that revealed rather than concealed. He stood in the center of her study, the place where her mind had worked, and saw it now not as an empty space, but as a space full of evidence, the evidence of absence. He noticed things he had missed. On the wall, faint rectangular outlines, paler than the surrounding paint, marked where her pictures had hung. He tried to recall a single one and failed. He had been in these rooms perhaps a dozen times in 18 years, usually to ask her to arrange something, his mind already on the next task before he had finished his sentence. He had looked at her, but he had not seen her. He ran his fingers along the empty bookshelves again. This time, he did not feel the clean surface. He imagined the weight of the books that had been there: histories, philosophies, poetry. What had she been learning? What had she been thinking in this room while he was in his office managing his empire? He had assumed her world was an extension of his, a support system. It was now terrifyingly clear that she had been running a parallel government, a shadow state built on principles he was only just beginning to comprehend. Attention, trust, communication. He knelt down, his expensive suit creasing, and looked under the desk. Taped to the underside, almost invisible in the gloom, was a small, plain manila envelope. His heart hammered against his ribs. This was not part of the official, orderly withdrawal. This was something else, a breadcrumb. He tore it from its mooring. Inside was a single, old-fashioned key and a small, folded note. The note contained an address, handwritten in her precise script. It was an address in Insadong, the old arts and antiques district. Beneath the address were 2 words, 3 o'clock. He looked at his watch. It was nearly 7 in the evening. He had missed it. Of course he had missed it. He had spent the day reacting to the collapse of his world, not proactively searching for its cause. He had been playing his own game, the game of power and damage control. She was playing a different one. This was not a trail of breadcrumbs for him to follow. It was a curriculum, a series of lessons, and he had already failed the first test. He had not been paying attention. The key was old and ornate, made of brass. He recognized the style. It was for a locker or a private box, the kind used by old establishments that valued privacy over digital convenience. The address in Insadong, he searched his memory. It wasn't the bank. It was a gallery, the Sedim Gallery, a place known for its quiet, scholarly exhibitions of traditional pottery and inkwash paintings. He had bought a piece there once, years ago, as a gift for a politician. Min-hee had handled the transaction. He sank back on his heels, the key cold in his palm. The sheer, painstaking deliberation of it all was staggering. The clean rooms, the logistical note, the cascading withdrawals from his business, and now this, a missed appointment, a clue. She had not just run away. She had constructed an elaborate, multi-layered lesson plan designed to force him to see the world as she saw it, a world where value was not declared but discovered, a world where timing mattered, a world where you had to show up, not just send a representative. He thought back to the single cryptic sentence in her note, "I have my own $5 now." It had infuriated him with its seeming irrelevance. Now, he felt the first stirrings of a different understanding. It was not a random number. It was specific. It was a symbol, a key to a story he did not know. What had happened with $5? Who had she given it to? Who had given it to her? The question was no longer an irritation. It was the beginning of a map of the 18 years he had looked without seeing. He stood up, his joints aching. The sun had set, and the room was filled with a deep blue twilight. The city lights outside seemed distant, alien. His world, his managed, visible world. It felt like a fiction. The real world, the one that mattered, was here, in this empty room, in the ghost imprints on the walls and the silent, demanding presence of a single brass key. He knew then that he could not delegate this. He could not send Director Choi or a team of investigators. He had to walk this path himself. He had to learn the lesson, no matter the cost. His empire was collapsing not because of an attack from an enemy, but because its heart had quietly walked out the door. And the only way to even begin to understand why was to follow. The memory surfaced, unbidden, as he stood in the deepening dark. It was from 18 years ago, a raw, wet afternoon in late autumn. He had just come from the funeral of Park Hyun-sik, his oldest friend and his most trusted enforcer, a man who had stood beside him since they were hungry teenagers in the back alleys of Busan. Hyun-sik had died, not in a blaze of glory, but from a quiet, swift cancer that had consumed him in less than 6 months. His death had left a hole in Kang's world, a void of absolute, unquestioning loyalty that could never be filled. After the funeral, he had gone to Hyun-sik's small, neat apartment to pay his respects to the family. There was no family. Only a 17-year-old girl with her father's impossibly solemn eyes, standing amidst the packed boxes of a life hastily dismantled. That was Min-hee. She was wearing a black dress that was too big for her, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She did not weep. She simply watched him, her gaze direct and unnervingly steady. He was a good man, Kang had said, the words feeling hollow and inadequate. He was my father, she replied, not as a rebuttal, but as a simple statement of a more profound fact. He had looked around the small apartment. It was a world away from his own life of expanding luxury, but it was orderly, dignified. On a small table was a half-finished Go board, the black and white stones forming a complex, unresolved pattern. Hyun-sik had been teaching her. He had been teaching her strategy. "What will you do now?" Kang had asked. It was a practical question, an administrator's question. "I will finish packing," she said. "I have a place at the university. I have some savings. I will be fine." He saw the fierce, brittle pride in her posture, the same pride her father had. Hyun-sik had never asked him for anything, not in 30 years. Kang felt a sudden, sharp pang of responsibility, of debt. He had built his empire on the bedrock of Hyun-sik's loyalty, a loyalty that had been absolute and uncompensated by anything so vulgar as a formal salary. It had been a bond of brotherhood, or so Kang had told himself. "Your father was my brother," Kang said, the words coming out with more feeling than he had intended. "His daughter will not want for anything. You will come and live with me. I have a large house. There is space." He saw a flicker of something in her eyes. Resistance. He had framed it as an offer, but it was a command. He was used to giving commands. He was arranging her life, just as he arranged everything else. He was solving the problem of Park Hyun-sik's orphan. She had hesitated for a long moment. He could see the conflict in her, the desire for independence warring with the stark reality of her situation. Finally, she gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. "If I am to live in your house, Chairman," she said, her voice quiet but firm, "I will not be a guest. I will work. I will earn my place." He had been amused by her formality, her seriousness. "Of course," he had said, waving a dismissive hand. "You can help with the household." He had no idea what that meant. He had staff. But it was the right thing to say, a way to grant her the dignity she so clearly craved. He had classified her then and there. A ward, a responsibility, a sentimental debt to be paid. She had arrived a week later with 2 suitcases and a box of books. She moved into the rooms he had assigned her, and for the first few months she was almost invisible. He would catch glimpses of her in the hallways, a silent figure who would nod respectfully and disappear. He noticed, vaguely, that the household was running more smoothly. The meals were better. The persistent draft in the library was fixed. The flowers were always fresh. He attributed it to a general improvement in the staff, perhaps spurred on by her quiet presence. The turning point came about a year later. He was hosting a critical dinner for a group of notoriously difficult investors from Shanghai. His regular chef was suddenly ill, and the catering company he had hired as a backup was a disaster. The food was late. The presentation was clumsy. He was growing furious, seeing the multi-million-dollar deal slipping away because of something as banal as a poorly cooked fish. He was about to erupt, to fire someone, to make an example when Min-hee appeared at his side. She had spoken to him in a low, calm voice. "Chairman, please allow me to handle this. Announce a short intermission. Take your guests to the terrace for drinks. I have a solution." He had been so taken aback by her sudden, quiet authority that he simply agreed. He led the investors outside, making a joke about letting the city air whet their appetites. From the terrace, he could see into the kitchen. He did not see panic. He saw Min-hee speaking quietly to the flustered catering staff. She was not giving orders. She was asking questions. She was organizing. 20 minutes later, they were summoned back to the table. An entirely new course was served, a simple but elegant arrangement of chilled noodles, perfectly seasoned vegetables, and delicate dumplings. It was exquisite. Later, his driver told him that Min-hee had sent him to 3 different restaurants in the neighborhood, places she knew, to acquire their best dishes. She had replated them, garnished them, and presented them as a single coherent meal. She had not cooked. She had curated. She had solved the problem not with power, but with knowledge and ingenuity. The deal was a success. The next day, he had formally put her in charge of his household. Over the years, her domain had expanded silently, organically. She took over his personal schedule, his correspondence, his travel arrangements. She became the interface between his corporate life and his personal existence. Then she had taken on the charitable foundations, transforming them from passive tax shelters into active, influential entities. She had done it all with such quiet competence that he had never registered it as an accumulation of power. He had seen it as an expansion of her function, the girl who helps with the household. He had failed to see the moment she had stopped being a girl and had become a woman. He had failed to see the strategist emerging from behind the solemn eyes. He had given her a place in his house, but he had never made a place for her in his world. He had paid for her education, but he had never asked her what she learned. He had provided for her, but he had never provided his attention. And she, in turn, had given him her loyalty, a quiet, diligent, 18-year loyalty that he had mistaken for permanence. He had taken the daughter of the one man who had never betrayed him, and he had created the conditions for her to leave, not with a dramatic betrayal, but with the quiet, devastating precision of a go-master placing a single, decisive stone on the board. The next morning, Kang drove himself to Insadong. He did not take his usual armored sedan or his driver. He took a nondescript black Hyundai from the staff motor pool, a car he had not driven in 15 years. Driving through the morning traffic of Yeongdo felt strange, alien. He was usually observing the city from a detached height, a map of his own making. Now he was in it, a part of the slow, grinding flow of ordinary life. The horns, the exhaust fumes, the sheer press of humanity felt raw, unfiltered. He found the Saram Gallery on a quiet side street, its facade a simple, elegant construction of dark wood and glass. He pushed open the heavy door and stepped into a space of profound tranquility. The air was cool and smelled of aged wood and ink. The gallery was a single, long room with gray stone floors. On display were a dozen pieces of Joseon-era porcelain, each one lit with the reverence of a holy relic. An elderly woman sat behind a simple wooden desk at the far end of the room, reading a book. She looked up as he entered, her eyes clear and intelligent. "I am looking for the director," Kang said. "You have found her," the woman replied, not smiling. Her name was Moon Soo-ki. He recognized her now from the society pages, a fiercely independent and respected figure in the city's art world. She was known to be beholden to no one. "I had an appointment yesterday," he began, "at 3:00. "You did," she said, closing her book and marking her page with a thin ribbon. "The appointment was with a piece of art. It is no longer here." "I was given this key," he said, placing the brass key on her desk. She looked at the key, then back at him. Her gaze was not hostile, but it was deeply analytical. She was assessing him. Miss Park arranged for a private viewing. She said you might be late. She said the reasons for your lateness would be instructive. The quiet humiliation of it stung. Min-hee had anticipated his failure. She had factored it into her lesson plan. What was I supposed to see? Kang asked. Director Moon stood and beckoned for him to follow. She led him to a pedestal in the center of the room. It was empty. It was a moon jar, she said. A 17th century piece. Not the most perfect example. It had a slight flaw, a hairline crack near the base, a result of the firing process. Almost invisible. But the glaze was exceptional. It had a depth, a warmth, a quality of life that the more technically perfect jars lack. It was the flaw that made it beautiful. It was the flaw that gave it character. She paused, letting the words settle in the quiet room. Miss Park has been visiting that jar once a month for the past 10 years. She would sit on that bench, she gestured to a simple wooden bench against the wall, and just look at it, for an hour. She said it taught her to pay attention to the things that powerful men dismiss as imperfections. Kang felt a strange, hollow ache in his chest. 10 years, once a month. A secret pilgrimage to look at a flawed piece of pottery. It was a whole universe of her life he had never known existed. She left something for you, Director Moon said. She walked back to her desk and retrieved a long, sealed tube of heavy cardboard. She handed it to him. She paid for the jar to be moved to a secure location yesterday at 4 o'clock. She said you would understand the significance of the timing. He did. She had given him exactly 1 hour. 1 hour to show up. 1 hour to demonstrate that he could operate on her timeline, not his. He had failed. He took the cardboard tube. It was surprisingly heavy. Thank you, he said. I am not doing this for you, Chairman Kang, she said, her voice clear and sharp as glass. I am doing this for her. She is a rare and valuable person, the kind of person who understands that the most important things are not for sale. The kind of person who knows the difference between price and value. I hope, for your sake, that you are capable of learning that lesson. He left the gallery and walked back to his car, the tube held tightly in his hand. The noise of the city seemed louder now, more chaotic. Director Moon's words echoed in his mind. The difference between price and value. He had spent his entire life mastering the language of price. He had negotiated multi-billion-dollar deals, hostile takeovers, political alliances. He could assign a precise monetary figure to almost anything. But value. Value was a different calculus altogether. Min-hee's loyalty, the dock workers' trust, Tanaka's confidence. He had received the benefit of their value, but he had never understood their worth. Because he had never paid the currency they required, attention. Back in the sterile silence of his penthouse, he opened the cardboard tube. Inside was not a document, but a rolled-up ink-wash painting on heavy rice paper. He carefully unrolled it on his dining table. It was a modern piece, but done in a traditional style. It depicted a single gnarled pine tree clinging to the edge of a cliff. The brushwork was stark, minimalist, yet full of a fierce, resilient energy. It was a beautiful, lonely image. Tucked into the roll was another small, sealed envelope. He opened it. Inside was a photograph and another note. The photograph was of a man he didn't recognize, a man in his late 60s with a kind, weathered face, standing in front of a small, dusty bookshop. The note contained another address, this time in a different city, Paju, the city of books. And beneath the address, a time. Tomorrow, noon. He looked at the painting, at the solitary tree. It was a portrait of endurance, of survival. He then looked at the photograph of the bookseller. This was the next custodian, the next lesson. Min-hee was not just showing him what he had missed about her. She was showing him the world she had built for herself, a world of quiet integrity, of art and literature, of people who valued things other than power and money. He was an intruder in this world, a clumsy giant, but he had to continue. He had to see it through. He had to get to the end of the trail, not to reclaim what he had lost, but to finally understand what it was he had so carelessly thrown away. The drive to Paju Book City the next day was 90 minutes of grim reflection. Kang drove himself again, the act of navigating the highways a small mechanical penance. Paju was a strange, master-planned city dedicated entirely to the life cycle of books. Publishing houses, printing presses, and vast warehouses, all designed with a stark, modernist aesthetic. It was a city built on words, a currency he had always used, but never truly respected. He had always seen words as tools for instruction or persuasion, not as vessels of meaning. He found the address from the photograph. It was a small, unassuming shop called The Last Page, tucked between the monolithic headquarters of two major publishing conglomerates. It was an anachronism, a place of dust and paper in a world of glass and steel. The man from the photograph was sitting outside on a small stool, mending the spine of an old book with a needle and thread. He looked up as Kang approached, his eyes crinkling at the corners. He did not seem surprised. "You must be Chairman Kang," the man said, his voice soft. "I am Han Young-soo. She said you would be punctual today." The faint praise did little to soothe Kang's unease. He had passed one simple test. It was nothing to be proud of. "Min-hee sent me." "I know," Han said, putting down his book repair. "She is a very special customer. My best customer, in fact. Though she rarely buys the most expensive books." He gestured for Kang to follow him inside. The shop was a labyrinth of towering shelves, crammed with books from floor to ceiling. The air was thick with the rich, dense smell of aging paper and leather. It was a smell from another century. There was no visible organizing principle. Poetry was wedged next to political science, obscure novels next to technical manuals. It was a library of chaos. "For 5 years," Han began, running a hand along a row of spines. "Min-hee has been coming here once a month. She never tells me what she is looking for. She simply browses, sometimes for hours. She has a gift for finding the book that needs to be found." He pulled a thin volume from a high shelf. It was a collection of poems by a long-forgotten dissident poet from the 1970s. "She found this. It was out of print for 40 years. We had one copy buried in a box of old textbooks. She read it. Then she took it to a publisher, a friend of hers at one of those big buildings next door. She convinced them to reissue it. She used a grant from one of her foundations to fund the first print run. The book is now on the national curriculum." He moved down the aisle. "This," he said, tapping a thick, academic-looking tome, "is a history of the Guro Industrial Complex, written by a retired factory worker. A memoir of exploitation and struggle. It was self-published. 10 copies existed. She found one. She had it translated into English and German. Last year, a German university awarded the author an honorary doctorate. He had been living in a one-room apartment, forgotten by everyone." Han continued to walk, pointing out books. A forgotten feminist novel, a collection of oral histories from the fishing villages that Kang's own company was preparing to demolish for his waterfront project. A children's book, written by a North Korean defector. Each book was a story of something or someone overlooked, ignored, or devalued. Each one had been rescued and championed by Min-hee. "She was not just buying books, Chairman," Han said, turning to face him. "She was conducting an archaeology of forgotten value. She was building an archive of the stories that people like you pave over. She paid for it all through her foundations. Your money, but her attention, her vision." Kang felt a wave of vertigo. The foundations. He had seen them as a tool, a way to generate goodwill for his brand. He had funded them, but he had never inquired about their work. He had assumed they were building playgrounds, funding scholarships. He had not realized they were funding an intellectual and moral resistance to the very world he represented. Min-hee had been using his own resources to build a counter-narrative to his life's work. "She left this for you," Han said, leading him to a small, locked glass case in a corner of the shop. He unlocked it and took out a heavy, leather-bound ledger. It was old, the kind of accounting book used before computers. It was completely blank. "This is your next lesson," Han said, handing the ledger to Kang. "She said you would know where to go. She also gave me a message for you. 3 words. Kang braced himself. "What are they?" Han looked at him with a deep, sorrowful pity. "It is not enough." The words were a quiet gut punch. It is not enough. Not enough to show up on time. Not enough to follow the trail. It was not enough to simply witness the world she had built. Something more was required of him. He took the heavy, empty ledger. As his fingers closed around the worn leather, another memory sparked. A conversation he had half overheard years ago between Min-hee and one of his accountants. They had been discussing a defunct subsidiary, a paper company that had been used for a complex land deal in the 90s and then abandoned. The accountant was recommending they shred the old financial records. "It's just dead weight," the accountant had said. "No one has looked at these in 20 years. "Nothing is ever dead weight," Min-hee had replied, her voice soft but firm. "It's just sleeping." She had insisted on moving the old records to a climate-controlled storage facility. At the time, he had thought it was a strange, sentimental quirk, an obsessive need for order. Now he understood. She was an archivist of the forgotten, not just of books, but of everything. He knew where he had to go. The storage facility. A place he hadn't thought about in a decade. The ledger was the key. The trip to the archival facility was a descent into his own past. The facility was located in a grim, industrial suburb on the outskirts of Yeongdo, a place of warehouses and smokestacks. It was a part of the city he owned but never visited, the engine room of his prosperity. He handed the blank ledger to the grizzled watchman at the gate, a man who had worked for Kang's father. The man nodded, his face unreadable, and waved him through without a word. The ledger was not a key. It was a passport, proof that he was on Min-hee's business. Unit 734 was a large, climate-controlled space filled with rows of gray metal shelving. On the shelves were hundreds of identical, numbered archive boxes. It was the physical manifestation of his corporate history, a library of deals, contracts, and secrets. He had assumed it was a graveyard. He was about to learn it was an armory. In the center of the room was a simple wooden table and a chair. On the table was a laptop computer, a single archive box labeled with the number of the defunct subsidiary, and a small porcelain cup containing freshly brewed green tea. It was still warm. She had been here. Or she had arranged for someone to be here, just moments before he arrived. The precision of her planning was breathtaking. He sat down and opened the laptop. The screen was black except for a single folder in the center, labeled Attention. He clicked on it. Inside was not a collection of files, but a single, elegant interface. On the left was a list of names: Director Choi, his other senior executives, his lawyers, his bankers. On the right was a complex, interactive timeline stretching back 15 years. It was a masterpiece of data visualization. It was a work of art. He clicked on the first name, Director Choi, his most trusted lieutenant. The timeline lit up. It showed every financial transaction, every phone call, every meeting Choi had conducted on behalf of the company. But it also showed something else. It showed a second, hidden timeline running in parallel. He opened the archive box. Inside were not dusty papers, but meticulously organized files. Cross-referenced bank statements from offshore accounts, encrypted communication logs, surveillance photographs. It was the raw data. The laptop was the translation. For over a decade, Director Choi had been systematically siphoning money from the company. Not in large, obvious amounts, but in 1,000 tiny, untraceable cuts. 0.1% from a currency exchange, an inflated invoice from a shell corporation in Panama, a consulting fee paid to a company that did not exist. It was a work of insidious genius, a slow, patient bleed that amounted to a staggering fortune. But the money was not the goal. It was the means. The timeline showed where the money went. It went to buying the loyalty of junior executives. It went to paying off regulators. It went to funding the campaigns of minor politicians, building a network of influence that was loyal not to Kang, but to Choi. He was building a shadow empire within Kang's own, a parasite preparing to kill its host. Kang felt a cold fury rise in him, so intense it made him dizzy. Choi. The smooth, capable, loyal Choi. The man he had been grooming as his successor. For 15 years, Choi had stood at his right hand, his face a mask of perfect deference, while he systematically dismantled his kingdom from the inside. He clicked on another file. It was labeled The Waterfront Project. The interface showed the official community outreach budget, and beside it, it showed Choi's secret payments to a radical environmental group, the same group that was now leading the public charge against the development. Choi wasn't just stealing. He was sabotaging. He was creating crises that only he could appear to solve, making Kang increasingly dependent on him while simultaneously weakening Kang's position. The union strike, the zoning delay, it was all Che. He had been orchestrating Kang's recent failures, positioning himself to be the savior. The depth of the betrayal was absolute. It was not a simple act of greed. It was a long, patient, meticulously planned coup. Kang had been so focused on managing his external enemies that he had never thought to look at the man standing beside him. He had trusted Che completely, without reservation. He had valued his performance, his efficiency. He had never paid attention to his character. And Min-hee had seen it all. The archive was her work. For years, while he had been dismissing her as the household manager, she had been conducting a secret, deep-cover internal investigation. She had been following the trails of forgotten data, connecting the sleeping facts, building a case. The bookseller, the gallery owner, they were not just custodians of clues. They were a part of her network, her intelligence agency of the overlooked. They were people of integrity who could see what she saw. He found a subfolder labeled The $5. He clicked it. It opened a single audio file. He pressed play. He heard Min-hee's voice, quiet and clear, but it was from a recording device, slightly tinny. She was talking to someone, an old man. "Here," she said. "Please, take this. Get yourself a hot meal." "Thank you, miss," a rough voice rasped. "But this is all you have. I saw you counting your change." "It is enough," Min-hee replied. "I have a job interview this afternoon. I'm not worried." There was a pause. "What kind of job?" the man asked. "It is not a job," Min-hee said, and her voice was filled with a strange, sad resolve. "It is a position in a large house. The man who owns it is a very powerful man. He was my father's friend." "Be careful, miss," the homeless man said. "Powerful men do not have friends. They have assets." The audio file ended. Kang closed his eyes. The breath went out of him. The recording was dated 18 years ago, the day she had agreed to come live with him. Her last $5. She had given her last $5 to a homeless man, a man she would never see again, on her way to deliver herself into a life of gilded captivity. And in that single anonymous act of grace, she had demonstrated a character he had spent the next 2 decades failing to appreciate. The homeless man had seen more clearly in 5 minutes than he had in 18 years. Powerful men do not have friends. They have assets. He had treated her as an asset. He had treated her father's memory as an asset. He opened his eyes. The archive was not just an indictment of Choi. It was an indictment of him. Min-hee had not left this for him to find out of revenge. She had left it for him as a final report, the ultimate act of loyalty. She had protected the company, his legacy, even as she was walking away from the man who had failed to see her. She had done her job, her real job, the one he had never given her. She had paid attention, and now he finally understood the message from the bookseller. It is not enough. It was not enough to know. Knowledge without action was just another form of passive observation. He had to act. He had to dismantle Choi. But more than that, he had to find her. He had to stand before her, not as a chairman, not as a powerful man, but as the man who had finally, belatedly, understood the report. The man who had finally learned to read. On the table, next to the teacup, was one last item he had overlooked. A single, folded train ticket. A one-way ticket to a small, coastal town called Somé, departing the next morning. It was not a clue. It was an invitation. The train ride to Somé was a journey away from everything Kang knew. The gleaming skyscrapers of Yeongdo gave way to sprawling suburbs, then to rolling green hills and patchwork fields of rice. The world outside the window grew quieter, slower, more real. He held the ticket in his hand, a simple piece of paper that felt heavier than a stock certificate. It was a ticket to a conversation he was not sure he was prepared for. Somé was a small fishing town clinging to a rocky coastline. The air smelled of salt and diesel and drying fish. It was a place of hard work and little pretense. There were no towers of glass and steel here, only low, weathered buildings and the vast, gray expanse of the sea. Following a hand-drawn map that had been tucked inside the ticket's folder, he walked through the narrow streets until he reached a small, whitewashed temple on a hill overlooking the harbor. He found her in the temple's garden. She was on her knees, tending to a small patch of moss, her back to him. She was wearing simple cotton pants and a loose shirt, her hair tied back. She looked younger, more relaxed than he had ever seen her. The 18 years of quiet, formal tension seemed to have melted away. She was just a woman in a garden. He stopped a few feet away, unsure what to say. The script he had been rehearsing in his head, a mixture of apology and explanation, suddenly felt absurdly inadequate. She did not turn around. "The moss is very delicate," she said, her voice calm and even, carrying easily in the still air. "You cannot force it to grow. You can only create the right conditions, the right amount of shade, the right amount of moisture. And then you wait." She patted the moss gently with her fingertips and then stood, turning to face him. Her eyes, the same solemn eyes he remembered from her father's apartment, regarded him with a quiet, unnerving clarity. There was no anger in them, no accusation, just a deep, profound stillness. "You found the archive," she said. It was not a question. "I did," he said, his voice hoarse. "Choi." "I have known about Director Choi for 7 years," she said, cutting him off. "I started watching him when I noticed small discrepancies in the foundation accounts. He was too clever to leave a clear trail, so I had to learn to see in the dark. I had to learn to read the patterns in the data he thought no one was looking at. It took a long time. 7 years. She had been fighting a secret war on his behalf for 7 years, while he had been, what? Attending galas, negotiating deals, believing himself the master of his universe. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked, the question sounding weak even to his own ears. She finally showed a flicker of emotion, a deep, weary sadness. "Would you have listened? Or would you have seen it as an unsubstantiated claim from your household manager against your most trusted director?" You trust what is loud, Chairman. You trust performance. Choi is an excellent performer. I am quiet. The truth of her words was devastating. He would have dismissed her. He would have told her to stick to managing the house. "I built the archive for 2 reasons," she continued, her voice regaining its calm precision. "First, to protect the company and the people in it who are innocent, the people whose pensions Choi would have stolen, the families of the workers, your father's legacy, my father's legacy. Second, I built it as a failsafe. I knew a day would come when I would have to leave. I could not leave the company vulnerable. The archive was my final act of responsibility." She looked out at the sea. "I had 2 plans. Plan A was that you would not notice my absence in any meaningful way. You would hire a replacement and your life would continue. In that case, after a month, the archive would be delivered anonymously to the board of directors and the national prosecutors. Choi would be removed and the company would be secured. My work would be done." "And Plan B?" he asked. "Plan B," she said, turning her gaze back to him, "was that you would notice, that the foundations of your world would shake just enough for you to start asking questions, that you would follow the trail I left, not because you wanted to find me, but because you needed to understand what you had lost. The trail was not for you to prove anything to me. It was for you to prove something to yourself, that you were capable of paying attention." He stood before her, stripped of all his power, all his authority. He was not Chairman Kang. He was just a man who had failed a 17-year-old girl, a man who had been blind for 18 years. "The $5, he said, the words barely a whisper. I heard the recording. A small, sad smile touched her lips. The old man was right. You saw me as an asset, an efficient, reliable, loyal asset, and I let you. That is my part in this. I stayed in the role you gave me because it was safe, because I was afraid, and because I thought I could do some good from the inside, quietly, in the margins." She took a step closer. "But I am not an asset, Chairman. I am a person, and I am tired of living in the margins of your life." "What you did," he said, struggling to find the words, "with the archive, with Choi, it was the most loyal act I have ever witnessed." "No," she said firmly. "It was a competent act. My loyalty was something you assumed you were entitled to. You confused it with my competence. I did my job. My loyalty is something you will have to earn, if you even want it." This was the crux of it, the final, brutal lesson. He had never earned it. He had inherited it from her father, and then taken it for granted. "I want it," he said, and the simple words were the most honest thing he had said in 2 decades. "I don't know how, but I want to learn." She studied his face for a long time, her expression unreadable. He felt like he was being weighed and measured on a scale he did not understand. "Choi will not go quietly," she said, her tone shifting, becoming operational. "When he realizes you know, he will move to seize control of the company. He has the board proxies, he has the political leverage. The archive is proof, but proof takes time to present. He will try to trigger a crisis before the truth can come out. What do we do? He asked. The we felt audacious, unearned, but he said it anyway. She did not reject it. We do not play his game, she said. We do not fight him for control of the company. We dismantle the company's ability to be controlled. We introduce a variable he cannot manage. We go public. Not with the accusations, but with the data. We release the core of the archive to a consortium of international financial journalists. We activate the jurisdiction of the American SEC through your New York listing. We give the problem to people Choi cannot buy or intimidate. We burn the house down to save the foundations. He stared at her, stunned. It was a strategy of breathtaking audacity. It was corporate suicide. It was also brilliant. It was a go-master's move, sacrificing a large, obvious territory to secure a smaller, more valuable one. This will destroy the company as it exists, he said. Yes, she said. What is seen is managed. We will make everything seen. Then, if there is anything of value left, you can try to build something new, something better. He looked at her, at this woman he had thought he knew, and saw a strategist who was his equal, if not his superior. She was not asking for his permission. She was presenting the only viable path forward, the path he would have been too proud, too arrogant to see. Okay, he said. Just that one word. She gave a small, sharp nod. The conversation was over. The negotiation had begun. She turned and walked back toward the temple building, then paused. There is a guest house in the village. They are expecting you. The work begins in the morning. Get some rest, Chairman. He watched her go. He was no longer a chairman. He was a student. And school was about to begin. The guest house was a single room with a sleeping mat on the floor and a window that looked out onto the gray sea. It was the simplest room Kang had stayed in since he was a teenager. He spent the night not sleeping, but staring out at the dark water, the immensity of his failure washing over him in slow, cold waves. He had built an empire of glass and steel on a foundation of sand, while Min-hee had been tending a garden of moss, cultivating a forest of forgotten books, and secretly reinforcing the structure he had neglected. The next morning, she arrived as the sun was rising, carrying a laptop and a satellite phone. There were no pleasantries. She was all business. For the next 48 hours, the small room became a war room. The two of them worked side by side, a strange and potent alliance. He brought his knowledge of the corporate structure, the legal loopholes, the personal weaknesses of the board members. She brought her encyclopedic knowledge of the hidden data, her network of trusted outsiders, and her cold, clear, strategic vision. It was a revelation. He watched her work, and it was like watching a grandmaster play a dozen games of chess simultaneously. She dictated emails to him, her language precise and legally airtight. She marshaled her contacts, the gallery owner, the bookseller, a retired judge he had never heard of, to prepare affidavits. She packaged the vast, complex data from the archive into digestible, explosive dossiers tailored for specific journalists and regulators. He, in turn, found a new kind of purpose. He was not commanding, he was facilitating. He used his authority, the weight of his name, to open doors that would have been closed to her. He made the calls. He leveraged the last vestiges of his power not to issue threats, but to ask for hearings, to demand attention from people who were used to ignoring uncomfortable truths. For the first time, they were working not as a master and a servant, but as partners. A grudging, provisional partnership, but a partnership nonetheless. The SEC filing needs a personal declaration from you, she said, looking up from her laptop. You need to attest that the company's previous financial statements were, to your new knowledge, fraudulent. It will open you up to prosecution." He did not hesitate. "Write it. I'll sign it." She looked at him, a flicker of surprise in her eyes. It was the first time he had agreed to a course of action that was directly and personally self-destructive. It was the first time he had put the integrity of the mission ahead of his own preservation. It was a small thing, but in the silent calculus between them, it mattered. As they worked, a ticking clock emerged. Mr. No, Kang's loyal and discreet head of security, the only person other than Min-hee he knew he could trust, was feeding them intelligence from Young-do. Choi had discovered the breach. He wasn't panicking. He was accelerating his plan. He had called an emergency board meeting for the following day at noon. The agenda: the removal of Chairman Kang on grounds of gross mismanagement and mental incompetence. He had the votes. The wavering allies, spooked by the port strike and the stalled waterfront deal, crises Choi himself had engineered, were now firmly in his camp. He would have control of the company in less than 24 hours. "He's moving faster than I expected," Min-hee said, her face grim. "He's going to consolidate his power before the journalists can even publish. He'll bury the story." "We need more time," Kang said. The old instinct, the desire to control the timeline, flared in him. "We don't have more time," she replied. "So we have to change the game. The board meeting is the battlefield. We can't win a vote, so we have to make the vote irrelevant." She began to type furiously. "The power of the board rests on the legitimacy of the company. We have to strip that legitimacy away before they can convene." "No," she said, handing Kang the sat phone. "Call No. Tell him to execute Protocol Indigo." Kang paused. Protocol Indigo was a ghost protocol, a scorched earth contingency he had designed years ago to protect the company from a hostile government takeover. It involved liquidating key offshore assets and transferring them to a neutral trust, effectively paralyzing the company's financial operations. It was a doomsday device. He had never imagined using it against his own board. "It will crater the stock price," he said. "It will destroy billions in shareholder value overnight." "Yes," Min-hee said without looking up from her work. "It will also freeze every asset Choi is counting on to reward his allies. It will